And first of all, I'd like to warmly commend the Chairperson, Deputy John McGuinness, and the Joint Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform, and the Taoiseach, that's the name of the committee, but also, of course, the Committee Secretariat and this committee staff for producing this timely and very valuable report on public-private partnerships for public sector infrastructure projects and the liquidation of the Carillion Group. The collapse of Carillion significantly delayed the delivery of the PPP contract known as the Schools Bundle 5, right down to the present, and raises very profound questions, Minister, about the continued use of the whole PPP process. That process has tied the Irish state into a system of large annual payments to PPP contractors down to the 2050s and indeed the 2060s. The informative report before us today may be put alongside the House of Commons report on the Carillion Company, which is a devastating indictment of the PPP approach, or what the UK Government refers to as private finance initiatives, which we copied, of course. And at the time of Carillion collapse, the Guardian newspaper responded to a report on Carillion by the UK National Office Audit by concluding that private financial initiative schemes, and I quote, as they have evolved, have simply not worked, end quote. And the leader of the UK Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn MP, of course, rightly refers to the dogma of privatisation, which he says has resulted in what he called an outsourcing racket to the detriment of public infrastructure for the British people. Carillion had around 43,000 employees, including 19,000 in the UK, when it collapsed in January 2018, and it left a pension liability, one of the most disgraceful results of that collapse, of around £2.6 billion. It also owed around £2 billion to its 30,000 suppliers and subcontractors, and further down the supply chain can, of course, our companies were caught and badly exposed, and their workers in this regard. The subsequent liquidation, of course, of Salmon Contracting Ireland, arising from Carillion collapse, led to grave difficulties in the delivery of Schools Bundle 5 under an Irish PPP, including serious adverse impacts, as I've said, on Irish subcontractors who worked on that school project. The House of Commons report castigates the management and governance of Carillion, whose board included Mr Philip Green, who was chairperson in 2014. Carillion's business model is described by the Commons as, and I quote, an unsustainable dash for cash, end quote, with the company, and I quote again, choosing to pay out more in dividends than the company generated in cash, end quote. The executives on board are accused of a chronic lack of accountability, and the culture of Carillion is described by the Commons as rotten. Yet, Minister, this company was chosen in July 2016 by the National Development Finance Agency to lead the Inspired Spaces Consortium with the Dutch Infrastructure Fund DIF to construct Schools Bundle 5, ultimately funded, of course, by us, by £250 million of state payments over a 25-year period. So this is the debacle into which this process has led us. The House of Commons report, of course, especially emphasises the role of auditors in the Carillion collapse and the fact that KPMG audited Carillion for 19 years, earning £29 million over that time. Deloitte were responsible, of course, also for advising Carillion's board on risk management, and clearly the auditors concurred with what the Commons calls, and I quote again, aggressive accounting policies to present a rosy picture to the markets, end quote. So I greatly welcomed our Finance Committee's focus in section 4.4 of their report on the role of auditors and due diligence procedures. The Chairperson and the Committee's request that the NDFA liaise with its counterpart agencies in other jurisdictions in relation to due diligence is timely and important. And it's good to read also that the UK Financial Reporting Council, the FRC, is conducting an investigation in relation to KPMG's audit of Carillion's financial statements. And clearly the Central Bank and our Office of Corporate Enforcement, the Director of Corporate Enforcement, must also review the outcome of the UK investigation and its impact on subcontracting companies here. We've heard, of course, too, in recent days in the Financial Times and other newspapers that the UK Government and Financial Reporting Council are proposing that the so-called Big Four accountancy companies in the UK should be simply broken up because of their predatory pricing of audits. The UK authorities also wish that financial consultancy work and auditing should be totally separate functions, not these sort of Chinese ceilings or Chinese walls or whatever, and not being carried out by the same company. So I'd like to ask then Deputy McGuinness, I know he can't be with us right now, but the Finance Committee, whether they would now go on to look at current regulation of auditing in Ireland and recommend whether we need to have similar reforms, whether we need to look at the whole performance of auditing and look at the Big Four dominance of our auditing market as well. Section 3.3 of the Finance Committee addresses the PPP policy framework itself and considers the findings of the Department of DPER's review that PPPs, that was carried out, of course, in 2017, Minister, I think before the Carillion collapse, whether PPPs should continue to be used with the emphasis on value for money at procurement stage. And they also recommend, I think, that a new alternative PPP model is being considered for future PPPs, yet we haven't heard a word of that here this evening in response to the committee's report. The Finance Committee, I think, correctly concludes that the PPP framework operates without the visibility and transparency required by the state to know whether the entire supply chain, that means our subcontractors and our workers, are paid appropriately for services provided, and that such full visibility and traceability of payments must be central to any future PPP contracts. And again, Minister, in your speech, you didn't address that central point about the 2013 Act, that there is no visibility, there is no traceability. I strongly support this conclusion and also agree that the 2018 deeper reform review, prior to, or 2017 it should be, prior to the Carillion and salmon collapses, must be revisited urgently. Indeed, the whole PPP process, I think, it's a kind of shadow banking, Minister. I know Deputy McGrath used to raise this issue, has raised this issue consistently in relation to shadow banking in relation to the car leasing companies and so on. This is shadow banking, though, in relation to our whole state and our whole procurement policy. So I believe the state itself should finance, construct and manage all major infrastructures for our people, whatever subcontractors and builders it wants to use in education, health, transport, public housing and other major public services. The Irish State has refused to take responsibility for regulating the construction of homes during the Celtic Tiger property bubble, and the Clerk of Works course role in public contracts was abandoned. And those of us who worked on sites, when we were students and so on, we knew that the Clerk of Works was there for the Dublin Corporation or Dublin County Council, in my own case, to make sure that the work was done properly. But that was all abandoned by the Éireann government. So it's no wonder that Section 3.4 of this report states that the certification of works is arguably the single most contentious issue to emerge in the course of the committee hearings. Certification, of course, is necessary in order for a completion certificate to be granted by the Buildings Approval Authority, and this certification, of course, is governed by BCAR, the Building Control Amendment Regulations and the Code of Practice. But it's striking that even hearing from subcontractors, the committee felt that the present certification process may expose the state to future liabilities in terms of insurance cover and health and safety regulations, which is, again, an astonishing conclusion, Minister. Again, the NDFA has a huge role to play in making this certification process more accountable if there is to be any future PPPs. And I know the committee supports what it calls a pragmatic and sensible approach, whereby the PPP company and the replacement contractor, which of course is Woodvale, engage with the original supply chain to make sure that you have certification at each stage. I'd also strongly echo the committee's view in section 4.1 that there is a lacuna in legislation regarding the protection of payments and entitlements to subcontractors and to their workers. Now, you mentioned the 2013 Act, but there is no traceability, there is no visibility there. I think what we need to think about, on behalf of our subcontractors and workers and all their families and contacts and so on, what we need to look at, I think, Minister, here is new legislation. Clearly, any review of the Construction Contracts Act 2013, it will show that multifaceted new legislation is necessary for the proper protection of subcontractors and their staff. The losses in outstanding payments sustained by as many as 400 subcontractors in the School Bundle 5 debacle may total at least €14 million, with a profound negative impact on smaller companies, their workers and families, and they shouldn't have been exposed by our state to that kind of suffering. That's the reality. So the proposal for a contingency fund in section 4.6 of the Finance Committee's report is crucial. The state should at least take this step to protect subcontractors and frontline workers and suppliers, and any future winning consortium should be obliged to set aside such a contingency fund, that we should demand that before any works proceed. And it echoes, of course, a similar proposal from the House of Commons investigation into any future PFIs in the UK. I just note, Can, as well, that I'd like to commend Senator Alice Mary Higgins and her colleagues in the Civic Engagement Group, Senators Lynn Rowan, John Dolan, Colette Kelleher and Francis Black, for bringing forward, you might have seen it arrived on our desks recently, her Public Authorities and Utility Undertakings Contract Preparation and Award Criteria Bill 2019. And I was delighted to see that pass second stage in Éireann. And again, I hope Senator Higgins' bill, of course, it will give further effect to the European Parliament's Directive 2014/24/EU and to Directive 2014/25/EU, and it provides, of course, for the use of social consideration and best quality ratio, cost effectiveness ratio as criteria to award public contracts. So I think it would be another step forward, and I hope the government will weigh in behind that when it comes before us in this House and ensure that it's passed. So in conclusion, I want to again warmly commend the Chairperson, Deputy McGuinness, all the other deputies and senators who are on the Finance Committee I was proud to serve on myself in the past, and also, of course, our staff who prepared this report. I want to commend them all. And obviously, it's started, I hope, an important debate, and I hope to which the government will, if you like, sincerely and deeply respond in terms of necessary legislation and changes. Thanks, Can.
Thank you, Deputy Broughan.